Raymond Burr may be best known as the steely-eyed defense attorney Perry Mason or the justice-driven detective in Ironside, but behind the courtroom drama and sharp suits was a man with secrets and scars that never healed. While he was solving fictional mysteries on screen, Burr was building walls in real life, nursing grudges that stretch across decades, and burying truths he refused to let the world see. To the public, he was the face of reason, of morality, of justice. But off-screen, he kept a meticulous scorecard, and he never forgot a slight. For years, Hollywood insiders whispered about Burr's long memory and his quiet feuds. He didn't lash out in tabloids or stage public breakdowns. Instead, he used silence like a weapon, carefully cutting off those who crossed him, whether they were producers, co-stars, or even former friends. While other actors made headlines for wild antics or scandalous affairs, Burr's reputation was different. He was a man who held grudges like heirlooms, polished, preserved, and passed down quietly through the years. But why was Raymond Burr so guarded? The answer begins in his early years in Hollywood, a time when conformity was king and secrets were currency. Burr entered the industry with ambition but also baggage, stories about his past that didn't quite add up, relationships he never acknowledged publicly, and a private life wrapped in contradictions. Whether it was pain, pride, or protection, he became an expert at managing his image and eliminating those who threatened it. One of the most infamous aspects of Burr's story was the invention of a tragic personal backstory. He claimed to have been married and widowed, even fathering a son who died young. Yet no evidence ever surfaced, and studio investigators quietly concluded these tales were fictional. Why would a man invent a life of grief? Some say it was to deflect attention from the life he actually lived, one that Hollywood wouldn't have accepted at the time. As the years went on, Burr became increasingly isolated. While his career continued to thrive, his inner circle shrank. Those who stayed close described him as loyal but exacting, warm but wary. He never forgot a betrayal, and forgiveness wasn't part of his vocabulary. In his later years, as he battled illness and faced the end of his storied career, the bitterness seemed to harden rather than fade. This isn't just the story of a Hollywood legend. It's the story of a man who built an empire of control and secrecy, a man whose kindness could turn cold without warning, and whose grudges became his quiet legacy. Raymond Burr wasn't just playing roles. He was performing every day of his life, hiding wounds behind authority and bitterness behind calm. And as we peel back the layers, what emerges isn't just scandal or sorrow. It's a portrait of a man who never truly put the past behind him. In 1950s Hollywood, image wasn't just important, it was everything. And for Raymond Burr, that image had to be airtight. Studios sold their leading men as paragons of masculinity and family values. Any deviation from that mold could end a career before it started. Burr knew the stakes, and from early on, he mastered the art of omission. While other stars leaned into publicity, Burr leaned into mystery. He didn't just avoid personal questions, he rewrote the answers. Burr's biography was a tangled web of half-truths and fiction. He spoke often of a late wife, Annette Sutherland, who had tragically died in a plane crash. He also mentioned his son, Michael, who had succumbed to leukemia at age 10. These stories earned sympathy and seemed to explain his quiet, somber demeanor. But as years passed, reporters began asking questions. There were no records of the marriage, no birth certificate, no plane crash. Eventually, it became clear none of it had happened. So why invent such a heartbreaking past? Some say it was a distraction, a deliberate attempt to mask what Burr truly wanted to keep hidden. At a time when actors could lose everything for being seen at the wrong bar or with the wrong companion, many in the industry invented fake relationships or tragedies to throw the public off the scent. In Burr's case, his grief-stricken narrative gave him cover. It explained his bachelor lifestyle, his reluctance to remarry, and his intensely private nature. The truth, insiders later suggested, was far more complicated. Burr had long-term relationships with men, most notably actor and model Robert Benvdas, who remained by his side for over 30 years. But Burr never acknowledged the relationship publicly. Even after laws and attitudes began to shift, he remained tight-lipped, maintaining the lie until his death. For Burr, silence wasn't just a habit, it was survival. Yet this silence came at a cost. Burr carried his secrets like armor, and those who got too close often found themselves kept at arm's length. Friends noted his warmth but also a certain distance, a constant sense that he was always holding something back. In private, he could be generous, funny, even tender. But in public, he remained composed and enigmatic, a man whose true self only slipped through in brief moments, never long enough to pin down. This double life took its toll. While his characters fought for justice on screen, Burr was constantly guarding himself off-screen. Every interview, every public appearance was a careful dance, never revealing too much, never inviting the kind of scrutiny that could end everything. And over time, that constant vigilance turned into something else: resentment. He resented the lies he had to tell. He resented the people who questioned him. And most of all, he resented the industry that forced him to choose between truth and survival. That bitterness, quietly brewing behind the scenes, would follow him through the rest of his life. But Burr's secrets were only part of the story. The grudges he carried would soon take on a life of their own. Raymond Burr was a man who never forgot a slight, and he rarely forgave one either. In an industry full of charming backstabbers and political maneuvering, Burr played the long game. He didn't blow up or cause scenes. He remembered. He waited. And when the time came, he made sure those who crossed him felt it. That quiet, slow-burning approach to revenge earned him a reputation among Hollywood insiders. Don't mess with Raymond. His grudges weren't petty. They were often rooted in betrayal, disloyalty, or breaches of trust. One of the earliest fractures came from within his own studio circle. During the mid-1950s, when Burr was still clawing his way into leading roles, he was up for several key parts, ones he felt he deserved, had earned. But producers repeatedly passed him over in favor of actors with more polished public images or convenient personal lives. Burr believed, correctly many now say, that whispers about his sexuality played a role in sidelining his career. The resentment started there. While other stars climbed fast with studio PR machines behind them, Burr had to work twice as hard, knowing that any personal misstep could be career-ending. So he remembered every producer who cast him aside, every co-star who fed the rumor mill, every executive who smiled to his face and cut him loose behind closed doors. And when Perry Mason finally gave him the clout he had long fought for, Burr didn't forget. He turned down interviews with publications that had once questioned his personal life. He refused to work with certain directors or actors he believed had contributed to smear campaigns. His approval was everything on set. If Burr didn't like you, your role suddenly shrank or disappeared altogether. He wasn't loud about it. He was methodical. One of the most talked-about feuds was with an early Perry Mason producer who reportedly clashed with Burr over creative control. Burr got his way, but the producer never worked on the show again. Years later, in private conversations, Burr would casually reference the incident with a cold smile. "He thought he could write me off," Burr once said to a close friend, "but I wrote the ending." Even more personal was Burr's quiet feud with a former co-star from a mid-century noir film. The actor, once a friend, had allegedly outed Burr at a private party, an act of betrayal Burr never confronted publicly but never forgot. That actor found himself shut out of certain roles. Many believed at Burr's insistence. Hollywood is small, and Burr's reach, especially after Ironside, was long. Despite these simmering vendettas, Burr maintained a public image of professionalism. He was always prepared, always kind to fans, always poised. But beneath that surface was a man who had been wounded deeply, and who had learned that in Hollywood, silence could be sharper than any headline. And this quiet campaign of control and remembrance wasn't just personal. It shaped how he chose his roles, who he trusted, and what legacy he would leave behind. Raymond Burr was a man of many secrets, and he built his life like a fortress to protect them. While fans adored him for his stoic, commanding performances in Perry Mason and Ironside, those closest to him knew a very different version of the actor, one who was intensely private, guarded to the point of obsession, and deeply afraid of what the world might do if it truly knew him. To outsiders, Burr's life seemed oddly empty. He had no wife, no public romances, and rarely appeared at Hollywood events unless absolutely necessary. Tabloids of the era hinted at his confirmed bachelor status, a euphemism well known to those within the industry. Burr didn't just avoid the spotlight, he actively redirected it. His interviews were notoriously evasive. Questions about his personal life were met with vague answers, charming misdirection, or polite silence. He constructed elaborate backstories that were later proven to be false or exaggerated. He told reporters he had been married once to a Scottish actress named Isabella Ward, and that she had died in a tragic accident. He even claimed to have had a son who died of leukemia. But records showed no trace of these events. They were stories, not history. Many now believe these fabrications were strategic, designed to give the press something to chew on without ever touching the truth. The truth, as suspected by many and later confirmed by close confidants, was that Burr was in a long-term romantic partnership with another man, Robert Benvdas, a former actor who became his business manager and constant companion. They lived together for over 3 decades, traveling the world, running a vineyard, and quietly building a shared life. But Burr never acknowledged the relationship publicly, not even once. The risk was too great. This carefully maintained wall of privacy wasn't just about hiding his orientation. Burr feared the impact on his career, his image, and even his safety. The 1950s and 60s were brutal decades for gay actors. Being outed often meant immediate blacklisting. Careers vanished overnight. Burr had worked too hard to let that happen. So he created a different version of himself, one that was palatable, uncontroversial, and always just a bit out of reach. The emotional cost of this secrecy was immense. Friends noted that Burr could be incredibly warm, generous, and affectionate in private, but also deeply melancholy, particularly in later years. There was a sadness that lingered behind the calm exterior, the sense of a man who had lived in half-shadow. His trust was hard-won and easily lost, and only a very small circle ever saw behind the curtain. Burr's fortress wasn't built out of arrogance or pride. It was born of necessity. But in locking the world out, he also locked parts of himself away. And as the years passed, the toll of that silence began to show. The public never suspected the pressure he was under, but behind the scenes, Burr was grappling with far more than fame or aging. Raymond Burr's silence wasn't just a personal choice, it was a survival strategy. But like most strategies built on fear, it came at a steep emotional cost. For decades, he played the role the world wanted him to play: the dignified leading man, the lonely widower, the solemn defender of justice on screen. But the real Burr lived with a constant, low-burning anxiety, knowing that if the illusion cracked, everything he had built could vanish overnight. Hollywood in the mid-20th century wasn't kind of men like Burr. Studios carefully crafted the public images of their stars, and any whiff of deviation from that image could result in immediate exile. For LGBTQ+ actors, it wasn't just about losing a job, it was about losing everything. So Burr, like many others, made silence his armor. He avoided interviews that felt too personal, turned down press tours, and refused to answer questions that strayed too close to home. But suppressing your identity for decades has consequences. Friends and colleagues noted that Burr's off-camera demeanor shifted as the years went on. He became more reclusive, less interested in the glittering social scenes of Hollywood, and increasingly focused on quieter pursuits like gardening, art collecting, and operating his vineyard with Robert Benvdas. These activities weren't just hobbies, they were safe zones, far away from the judgment and scrutiny of the public eye. Still, even in those quiet spaces, Burr's sadness was visible to those who knew him best. The burden of decades of concealment wasn't something he could shake off, even in retirement. He never had the freedom to publicly express love, joy, or grief in the way others could. Every milestone of his life, birthdays, anniversaries, even personal losses, had to be filtered through a lens of secrecy. That kind of pressure builds up, and Burr carried it heavily. There were moments when the mask slipped, even briefly. In rare, candid conversations with close friends, Burr would speak of a different life, one that might have been possible in a world less cruel. But those thoughts never made it into print. He made sure of it. What he couldn't control, however, was the slow erosion of his own mental peace. The weight of silence had begun to wear down even his famously composed exterior. Professionally, Burr remained respected and admired until the very end. But personally, he lived in a kind of emotional exile, cut off from the community and recognition he might have deserved. Many of his contemporaries faced the same fate: brilliant, talented people forced to live half-lives so their full truths wouldn't threaten the fragile fantasy Hollywood had built. Raymond Burr had mastered the art of hiding. But hiding, even when done perfectly, doesn't mean you're free. It just means you're alone in your truth. And as Burr aged, another quiet battle was beginning, one that would test not just his emotional endurance, but his physical strength too. As Raymond Burr entered the final decade of his life, the sharp edges of his public persona began to soften. Though still immensely private, there was a sense of weariness beneath the surface. A man who had played a role for so long, even he could no longer tell where the character ended and the real Burr began. The industry had changed slightly. Society had changed slightly. But for Burr, it was too little too late. He had spent his entire adult life protecting a secret that, by the 1990s, many no longer viewed with the same venom as in decades past. Still, the walls he built never came down. In his later years, Burr poured his time into philanthropy, traveling the world, and spending nearly every moment with his longtime partner Robert Benvdas. Though he never publicly acknowledged their relationship, those close to them understood the truth. Theirs was a deeply devoted, decades-long bond that had weathered both fame and fear. They bought property together, owned a vineyard, and supported charitable projects around the globe. It was a life lived quietly, but with meaning. As illness crept in, Burr's world narrowed. He was diagnosed with kidney cancer, though he kept the news from the public for as long as he could. When he did appear, he looked gaunt, tired, and older than his years, but the charm and gravitas remained. There was no grand announcement, no media coverage of his health decline. That, in a way, was how he had always wanted it. Burr didn't want sympathy. He wanted control over his story, even as it neared its end. Behind closed doors, his final days were spent at his Sonoma County home, surrounded by peace and privacy. Robert Benvdas was by his side throughout, an unwavering presence in a life otherwise defined by distance. Burr passed away on September 12, 1993, at the age of 76. There were no elaborate memorials, no sprawling Hollywood tributes, just a few obituaries, a few passing words from former co-stars, and a quiet acknowledgement from fans who remember him best as Perry Mason or Robert Ironside. Yet the legacy he left behind was complicated. Burr's career had been a towering success, but it was built on sacrifice. He had guarded his personal truth so carefully and never had a chance to truly breathe. Even in death, his partner's name was excluded from most official mentions. The world mourned Raymond Burr, the icon, but it still didn't fully know Raymond Burr, the man. Today, his story is a stark reminder of what Hollywood once demanded of its stars, not just their time, talent, and charm, but often their very identity. Burr gave everything the industry asked, and what he couldn't give publicly, he was forced to erase. But even silence leaves echoes. And in the years after his passing, those echoes would grow louder, revealing truths the world had never been ready to hear. In the years following Raymond Burr's death, the fortress of silence he'd so carefully built began to erode, not because he intended it, but because the world had changed. The fear that once gripped Hollywood began to lift. With time, the industry finally started to reckon with the pain it had buried for decades. It was in this shifting landscape that the truth about Raymond Burr's life began to trickle out. The most revealing voice was that of Robert Benvdas, Burr's partner of over 30 years. While he still spoke with dignity and restraint, his quiet interviews and public acknowledgments confirmed what many insiders had long suspected. Raymond Burr was gay, and he had lived in a committed, loving relationship with Benvdas since the 1960s. It wasn't a shocking revelation to those who had known them personally, but to the wider public, especially fans of Burr's stoic legal hero, Perry Mason. It was a startling glimpse behind the curtain. Benvdas never sought attention. He wasn't trying to out Burr in death or revise history. Instead, he was simply protecting the truth that had long been silenced. Through him, the narrative shifted, not to scandal, but to tragedy. The tragedy wasn't that Burr had a same-sex partner. It was that he had to hide that love for his entire public life, inventing wives, children, and heartbreaks that never existed just to maintain the image that Hollywood demanded. The press began re-examining Burrs' legacy. Retrospectives on his life no longer shied away from his long-term partnership. Biographers who once parroted studio-manufactured myths started digging deeper, and with that, a new story emerged, not just of a gifted actor, but of a man forced to sacrifice his truth for a career. The contradictions between the roles Burr played and the life he lived off camera became a poignant symbol of an era that silenced authenticity. In this new context, Burr's previously unexplained bitterness made sense. His refusal to engage with certain co-stars, his lifelong grudge against specific reporters, his distaste for press junkets and fame, these weren't just quirks. They were symptoms of someone who had to keep a lid on everything, always fearing that one wrong sentence could bring his world crashing down. And then came a cultural reckoning that changed how we view stars like Burr. Hollywood began to celebrate LGBTQ+ figures and acknowledge the quiet suffering endured by earlier generations. While Burr never had the chance to live openly, his story has since been reframed as one of resilience in the face of systemic oppression. He wasn't alone. Many stars of his era, from Rock Hudson to Tab Hunter, carried the same burdens. Burr just carried his incomplete silence. What remains most haunting is that Burr never got to experience a world where he could have spoken freely. He never got to watch his partner introduced on red carpets or thank him during award speeches. The truth was always right there, but the world wasn't ready to see it. Raymond Burr wasn't the only actor to live a double life under the suffocating expectations of old Hollywood. In fact, his story fits into a much larger tapestry of stars who conceal their identities, desires, and relationships just to survive in an industry obsessed with image control. For every public-facing romance crafted for the cameras, there were countless real love stories hidden behind closed doors, carefully protected from scandal-hungry tabloids and judgmental executives. Take Rock Hudson, for example, the classic Hollywood heartthrob who became the poster boy for masculine charm in the 1950s and 60s. Hudson, like Burr, maintained the appearance of a straight man to preserve his career. He even entered into a short-lived marriage to his agent's secretary, a strategic move orchestrated to quash growing rumors about his sexuality. It wasn't until his tragic death from complications related to AIDS in 1985 that the truth was laid bare. The revelation shook the entertainment world and forced the public to confront just how much pain was hiding beneath the glossy veneer of stardom. Another name often whispered among insiders was Tab Hunter, the teen idol whose career almost crumbled when rumors of his sexuality gained traction. He eventually confirmed the truth in his 2005 memoir, long after the peak of his fame. Like Burr, Hunter had been in a committed relationship. His partner was actor Alan Glazer, but the pressure to conform was relentless. He too lived with the anxiety of exposure, knowing one slip could undo everything. Montgomery Clift, a brilliant actor tormented by inner demons, also bore the weight of being a closeted man in a brutal system. Unlike Burr, Clift's struggles manifested in self-destruction, addiction, isolation, and emotional collapse. While he never publicly acknowledged his sexuality, those closest to him knew the truth. His pain was real, and so was the toll it took on his life and work. Even lesser-known but widely respected figures like Anthony Perkins, George Maharis, and Sal Mineo each contended with a culture that treated queerness like a career death sentence. These men weren't living wild or scandalous lives. They were simply trying to exist, to love, to be themselves in a time that denied them that basic dignity. Raymond Burr, in many ways, was typical of this hidden generation. The secrecy, the invented family tragedies, the persistent avoidance of personal questions, all part of the survival strategy. Unlike some, Burr never left behind a tell-all or confession. He chose to take his truth to the grave. But in doing so, he became symbolic of an entire era that forced silence on its brightest stars. And now, with more openness and historical reflection, their stories are finally being told, not as tabloid fodder, but as essential pieces of Hollywood history. These weren't just actors. They were survivors. And their quiet endurance speaks volumes about the costs of fame in a world that demanded masks at all times. For all his charm on screen, Raymond Burr carried a quiet storm beneath his polished exterior, a bitter undercurrent that, according to those who knew him best, never truly faded. As he aged, Burr became more reclusive, more guarded, and noticeably more cynical. The years had taught him not just how to survive, but how to hold on to the resentment that had built up after decades of erasing himself for Hollywood's benefit. What made Burr's bitterness so potent wasn't just what he had endured, it was how little the world ever acknowledged it. He had sacrificed personal truth for public success, yet rarely, if ever, was that trade respected or even recognized. His relationships were hidden, his identity denied, and despite his immense talent and work ethic, he was boxed in by a lie he could never safely correct. That's the kind of weight that can sour even the kindest soul over time. Close friends and associates described a man who was warm in private, but occasionally harsh when speaking about the industry he helped build. He reportedly harbored deep grudges, particularly towards studio heads, media figures, and former colleagues who had either outed others, enforced conformity, or participated in the whispered culture of betrayal that plagued Hollywood's closeted stars. Burr wasn't bitter without reason. He had seen promising careers shatter by nothing more than a rumor, watched friends drink themselves into oblivion, and learned that loyalty meant little in a business obsessed with appearances. He also never forgave the press. Burr was often a target of suspicion from journalists who sensed there was more to his story than he let on. Tabloids, even the so-called reputable trades, would sometimes take subtle jabs, questioning his lack of public romance or highlighting the holes in his personal history. Burr responded not with confrontation, but with silence and distance. He granted few personal interviews in his later years, and when he did, his answers were carefully measured, often rehearsed. By then, trust had long been eroded. Perhaps most tragically, Burr didn't seem to forgive himself either. There were moments, those close to him recalled, where he reflected with sadness about the life he could have had, the openness he might have enjoyed if the world had been kinder. But regret didn't sit comfortably with him, so he buried it beneath layers of professionalism, philanthropy, and controlled image. It was only in these rare, vulnerable moments that glimpses of the real Raymond emerged. And yet, despite all of this, Burr never lashed out publicly. He didn't name names or spill secrets, even as others did. His bitterness was quiet, almost noble in its restraint. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about memory. He never forgot who hurt him or how the system worked. That remembrance became a form of justice in itself, even if only he knew the full story. In the twilight of his life, Raymond Burr remained, in many ways, a man of contradictions, revered but misunderstood, wealthy but withdrawn, generous but emotionally guarded. While his public image as the stoic, honorable defense attorney Perry Mason endured, few understood the quiet complexities of the man behind the character. Even as his health declined, Burr maintained tight control over his public persona, ensuring that the truths he had spent a lifetime hiding would not be revealed until he was gone. In his final years, Burr was battling kidney cancer, a diagnosis he kept private for as long as possible. Much like his personal life, he saw illness as something to be endured quietly. He never wanted sympathy, he wanted dignity. Despite increasing pain, he continued working, appearing in the final Perry Mason TV movies with the same professionalism that had defined his career. Those closest to him say he never once complained on set. As the end neared, Burr took deliberate steps to secure his legacy. He donated millions to charities, particularly those focused on children, wildlife conservation, and education. He also made significant contributions to the causes his late partner cared about, ensuring their shared values were honored, even if their relationship had to remain a public secret. His estate, carefully managed, reflected a man who was not just wealthy in material terms, but rich in intentionality. Still, much of his personal history remained sealed, even to the end. He left behind no children, no memoirs, and few interviews that delved beneath the surface. While his obituary celebrated his television achievements and philanthropic efforts, it made no mention of the partner who had stood by him for over 3 decades. The omission was telling, not necessarily out of shame, but because Burr had conditioned himself to protect his truth at all costs. Yet, for those who read between the lines, the legacy he left was unmistakable. In private, he had been a quietly radical figure, a closeted gay man who rose to the top of one of the most conservative industries in America, maintaining his integrity while refusing to publicly conform. He never played the tabloid game, never cashed in on scandal, and never betrayed the secrets of others, even as he watched many of his peers destroyed by those very same pressures. To this day, Raymond Burr remains one of the most enigmatic icons of classic Hollywood. His story is not just one of success and secrecy, but of survival. His final act wasn't a confession, it was a quiet stand. He died on September 12, 1993, surrounded by a few trusted friends, having told the world only as much as he wanted it to know. And maybe that was his final defiant choice, to live on his own terms, and to die with the same discretion that shaped his extraordinary, bittersweet journey through the golden age of television. Raymond Burr's story isn't one easily told in black and white. He lived in the gray, between truth and myth, fame and privacy, heartbreak and resilience. While audiences saw him as the unshakable Perry Mason or the commanding Robert T. Ironside, those who knew him personally saw a man far more layered. His career was legendary, but his personal story, what he chose to hide, protect, and preserve, might be the most compelling part of all. In many ways, Burr embodied the quiet strength of an era that prized stoicism, but he also challenged the limitations that came with it. He crafted a public image not just for his audience, but as a shield, one that protected those he loved, his partner Robert Benvdas, and perhaps even himself. He didn't shout for recognition, didn't write a tell-all, and didn't wait for the world to change. He adapted, survived, and succeeded on his terms. And yet, his silence speaks volumes. It tells the story of how dangerous honesty could be in a time when personal truth could end a career. It reflects a Hollywood that demanded a polished mask over real identity, and the emotional toll that mask took on the stars who wore it. Burr was not the only one, of course, but few managed to maintain the illusion with such precision and grace. Today, as conversations around identity, legacy, and representation have evolved, Raymond Burr's life takes on a new kind of resonance. He's not just a classic TV icon, he's a symbol of the silent sacrifices so many in old Hollywood had to make. Behind every immaculate performance and award-winning role was a man negotiating with the world's expectations while fiercely guarding the life he built in private. In retrospect, his bitter grudges, as some biographers called them, weren't necessarily rooted in malice, but perhaps in grief, in protection, and unspoken pain. He never lashed out publicly, never aired his grievances, but it was clear to those around him that the cost of lifelong secrecy had left its marks. He was proud but private, successful yet burdened, loved but largely unseen in the way he may have truly longed to be. Still, Burr's story doesn't end in sorrow. His charitable work lives on. His performances continue to captivate. His quiet defiance, his refusal to betray others for the sake of gossip or scandal, earn him admiration from many in and outside the industry. And perhaps most poignantly, his love story, though unspoken publicly, endured longer than many celebrated Hollywood romances. Raymond Burr may have taken some secrets to his grave, but in doing so, he left behind something else, a reminder that strength sometimes looks like silence, that dignity can come with discretion, and that real legacy isn't just about what you show the world, but also about what you choose to protect.